Today I'm talking to Richard Nairn. Richard is an ecologist and writer. His latest book is Wild Waters, which is the third title in a trilogy which includes Wild Woods and Wild Shores. He is a lifetime naturalist who has worked as a nature reserve warden and was the first national director of Birdwatch Ireland. He lives on a small farm in County Wicklow.
Hello, Mary, and nice to speak to you as well.
Can you tell us where you are and just explain when you were looking out of your window earlier when we were chatting, what you can see, just to place the listeners?
Okay, I'm at home in County Wicklow, and I live on a small farm um, in a valley on the east side of County Wicklow. I can see a rocky mountain in the distance called Carrick, which is the Irish for rock, of course. And in between me and there's a deep valley. Our land slopes down to the bottom of the valley. We have a lovely wildflower meadow there, about 5 acres, and that stretches into an area of old woodland, which is in the valley bottom and has the river flowing through it. So we're very fortunate, and every day I get inspiration from just looking out the window before I even go out.
That sounds beautiful. And you've written a couple of books before, Wild Woods, and what are your other books that you've written? Because I know we're going to talk about the new one, Wild Waters.
Yeah, well, this is actually the seventh book that I've written. The first one was exactly 25 years ago. It was about Wicklow, called Wild Wicklow, actually. And since then, I've written about the Irish coastline, bird habitats, Dublin Bay, then the Woodlands book you mentioned, and my previous book was Wild Shores, which is about the Irish coastline. And this is the third in that series, the Wild series, as I call it, which are all written to a similar style, introducing the idea, the concept, with a kind of personal theme of my own experiences and travels, and then leading from that into the wonders of nature in those various different environments.
Yes. And is there a stream on your land, or where is your
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a short, fast-flowing stream that comes off the hill that I describe. And after a day of heavy rain, it's a rushing torrent. And then a day later, it dies down. It's only could be a foot deep, So it's quite variable, yeah.
And what kind of wildlife is associated with that stream?
Well, amazingly, well, there are trout in it, for instance. Mostly small, not much bigger than my hand. And there are otters using it. I see fresh otter spraint on rocks in the middle of the river. And I've actually photographed an otter using a sensor camera at that point in the river. And I have dippers. There are dippers nesting just about half a kilometre upstream under a bridge, and they come in occasionally. Lots of other birds. We have woodpeckers breeding in the woodland. Nothing to do with the river, of course, but using some of the old trees with the dead wood. And lots of other things. Because the ground is quite wet, we get woodcock in there in the winter, probing the soil, and some amazing flora as well.
Mm-hmm. So we're in the Burren here, and I think everybody knows a bit about the botany here if they've listened to this podcast all along. So we'll talk a little bit about the differences in botany, but we were talking just before we pressed record. Do you have a special animal, or is it birds that you're particularly connected to?
No, I'm an ecologist, so I'm interested in the whole ecosystem, and any aspect will fascinate me if it's something I haven't seen or discovered before. And I'm just as interested in insects or mammals or wild plants, as I am with birds.
What's your
in terms of
current interest?
Current interest.
Yes.
Well, just today, or this week, sorry, we had a white-tailed eagle flew over us. Now, it didn't stop. It just passed over, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought it was a buzzard to start with, and then I realized it was about 3 or 4 times the size of a buzzard. And it turned out that it was one of the ones released on the Shannon estuary there last year. And it was on a tour of Ireland, and it came to Wicklow and spent a few days here. And I was one of the few people fortunate enough to see it. So
that's very, very special. There was a couple of pairs introduced in an effort to control the fox population. Am I correct?
No. This is a much bigger project. Initially, about 15 years ago, they introduced about 50 of them taken from Norway under license, brought into Killarney National Park, released there. And they've started to breed all over the country now. Well, primarily on the Midland Lakes. For example, Lough Derg has 2 pairs of eagles nesting, or some years, other years they don't succeed. And they seem to be feeding primarily on fish, which they catch in the lakes. So there's plentiful supply there, and there's no threat to farming or anything like that there. They're quite harmless as regards people.
That's very magical. We had a talk on our project, and he said that so it would have been last year, one of the female eagles lost its life somehow. I'm not too sure how. So there was left with a male and a group of hatchlings. Did you hear this story?
Yeah, there was an outbreak of avian flu, and some of the birds caught that. But there's also been a few poisoning incidents where they've taken poison bait and haven't survived.
Yeah, this is a huge.
But by and large, they're surviving.
This story, he told us that because obviously they're tagged and they're monitored. The male was left with the clutch of young.
No.
A female that had emigrated to the UK returned. It was one of the young ones from the previous year, returned to the male to the nest and helped him rear the young. And when they were finished rearing the young, the male, who had never been in Norway, flew off to Norway.
Amazing. Yeah.
So, I mean, we don't understand their intelligence. It's on a different
but
spectrum.
they are very long-lived, and there's a big investment in each chick, because if they survive, then they're long-lived as well. So they produce a lot of young as well. So, but it's very much a long-term project, this reintroduction. And it depends on the survival of a relatively small number of individuals at the beginning to establish a breeding population that is there to stay. And so it can take 20 years before you can be sure there's a viable population. Me at the beginning about my favorite species.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very hard to choose, because I mean, every day I see something that excites me. Might be solitary bee, for instance, in a nice dry bank. But I guess the prize is probably goes to the otter, which I've seen in a number of places around the country. And I think they're really exciting animals because they are top predators, depending largely on fish, but they also eat a large range of other things like frogs and crayfish and even water birds. But I suppose my most memorable encounter was on the River Shannon, when I was walking the banks of the River Shannon through one of those beautiful riverside meadows called the Callows, north of Lough Derg. And suddenly I heard this squeaking sound in the grass ahead of me. And I stood still, listened, couldn't see anything. And then suddenly around my feet, I had two or three otter cubs that had come out of the grass and were kind of confused. They looked as if they were a bit terrified by coming across I might have been the first human they saw because they were very small. And then I heard an adult calling to them from the river bank, which was maybe 20 meters away. And so I retreated and the cubs went off to their parent. But that was a really memorable experience. And
that's absolutely.
I associate that with the River Shannon.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. I visited a couple that did otter rehab and release. So they'd get cubs that maybe had been abandoned by the mother. So they might take 1 or 2 cubs a year. And they had a little place by their house and there was a lake nearby. So when they got old enough, they could go out temporarily to the lake and eventually release. But I remember them saying to me that you can't leave otter cubs to survive because they have no sense until they're 1 year old. They have no common sense. So they get in all sorts of troubles and they need to be minded for 1 full year. And at that point, then you can consider the release. So that was their experience. But they are such a magical animal. And I've seen them around Dungora Castle in Kinvara in the bay, which it's magical when you see them.
Unfortunately, the adults do get killed on the roads occasionally, particularly if they're crossing a bridge, from one side or a culvert from one part of a river to the other. And if it's a pregnant a female with young cubs, they're left abandoned. But we really should remember these are wild animals. They're as wild as wolves in America, and really we shouldn't interfere with them. I think even if we find an abandoned cub, I would tend to leave it because I think if the adult is nearby, we can't assume it's been abandoned, put it that way.
Yeah, true.
And the same goes for seals on a beach. I mean, too many people find a seal cub and their first reaction is take it home and put it in the bath,
Yeah.
And really they should leave it because it's a wild animal. It's natural for parent and cub to get separated at times when the adult goes off to feed. Same with the otter. And we should just be patient, retreat, watch it from a distance, and you'll probably find the adult.
It is it's a problem with the seals and leverets as well, because of course the hair leaves the leverets around. So non-intervention is.
I mean, the intentions are genuine, I think, but very often the information is wrong.
Is incorrect. Yeah. And what's your opinion on reintroducing bigger predators like wolves?
I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime. Ireland doesn't have the habitat they need. They need extensive areas of forest. They are essentially forest animals, and you'll see if you look into history, there's plenty of reference to wolves living in the extensive forests in Ireland. As the forests were cleared and they became, more exposed, they retreated to mountains and so on. But they were eventually hunted to extinction in around, I think, mid-1700s. The odd one survived into the early 1800s. But I think there are other species that might merit reintroduction before wolves. Even introduction. One of them is the beaver.
I thought you were going to say beavers. He's so useful.
There's absolutely no evidence in history or archaeology that beavers were ever here. There's no record of any beaver chewed wood, for instance, or no bones have been found. But they were quite extensive in Britain. And that doesn't mean they didn't occur here. They maybe just haven't found any remains. But I think we shouldn't be afraid of introducing non-native species if they're non-invasive and if they have some benefits in the ecosystem. And the beaver is often described as a keystone species. In other words, it can have significant effects on the ecosystem and on a whole range of other species, just as the wolves in America can do. For example, they build dams, leaky dams, you could say, on rivers, and that can hold back floods. It creates foraging areas for other species, for birds, for fish, while still allowing migratory fish like eels and salmon to pass through. So they have huge benefits to the ecosystem, and they're quite harmless. They don't do any damage to agriculture or anything of the kind.
And they're so cute.
Well, that wouldn't be my primary reason for introducing
but they are
them.
So adorable.
I really think, though, it could be difficult because the policy here is for species where there's no record of native status, shall we say, of refusing any licenses to introduce. So,
yeah, I think it would it would be a big step for the NPWS.
The experience with invasive species like mink and dare I say it, some of the introduced deer like Sika deer is not good, and so I think if there's any doubt, the authorities would refuse a license.
No, exactly, and the grey squirrel. We better get around to talking about your book. So can you tell me what inspired you to write this one, Wild Waters?
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to the beginning of the pandemic and lockdowns, when you'll remember we were first of all restricted to 5 kilometers from home, I think it was. And as I live in County Wicklow, I thought, well, you know, I'm not going to stay in my house for however long it takes. So I decided I'd explore one of the longest rivers in County Wicklow called the Avonmore. And this rises in the mountains close to the Dublin border and flows for about 65 kilometres down the east side of Wicklow and into the sea at Arklow, which is almost on the Wexford border. So it's really takes in most of County Wicklow. It flows out of some very well-known places like Glendalough and Glenmalure and the other glacial valleys on the east side of Wicklow. So with a number of friends, I walked the full length of the river from source to sea, including a number of the tributaries and the lakes, and really got to know the river and you know, its whole life cycle, from the fast-flowing mountain stream, which is a bit like our childhood when we're running around the place with massive energy, through the sort of midlife period in the slow-flowing, sluggish part of the river to the sea, where it finally expires in the salt water. So yeah, it kind of mirrors our own life cycle. And I like that. But, you know, rivers have such a fascination because they have very distinctive wildlife. They're often in nice wooded areas, going through the lower parts at least. They flow through mountain bogs near the sources. Our ancestors, of course, valued them much more than we do. They were like highways across the country, where when the country was covered in dense woodland. And that's my dog barking outside.
Yes, that's fine. You just have to tell us his name now, or her name.
Her name is Molly, and
Molly.
she's a Labrador, but she's normally very quiet until a visitor comes.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
yes.
And of course, our ancestors valued rivers and lakes very much for the resources that they provided: fish, wildfowl, reeds for thatching, willows for basket making, and all the rest. And then you just have to think about their value for tourism. For instance, the River Shannon, is a big attraction for overseas tourists. Lakes of Killarney. Glendalough is one of the most visited valleys in the country. or Glencar waterfall in Sligo, which is the second highest waterfall in Ireland, and much associated with Yeats and his poetry. So, they all have a really a significant value to us, and I think that value is often overlooked when we treat the rivers and lakes quite badly.
Yes, I think well, a lot of nature is neglected and not respected, but that's what we're working on. There's a general underswell of people realizing the value of nature, but it needs to momentum.
Well,
to
unfortunately, it's worse than neglect, because with rivers, we've had a steady increase in polluted river waters. Over half now showing poor quality, and in the 1980s, 40 years ago, there were more than 500 pristine rivers, absolutely crystal clear with no pollution. Now there are less than 20. So,
my goodness,
think about that in terms of a reduction in value.
That's terrible. That's given me complete shivers.
That
happens so quick. I mean, obviously I'm aware of the pollution, but the fact that has happened since the 1980s is very disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, another aspect that people don't think about is the barriers on rivers. It's calculated there are over 70,000 barriers to fish migration on the Irish river system, 70,000, and these include weirs and dams and sluices and culverts and some bridges even, which are barriers to salmon and eel and lamprey, and many of them are redundant. Of course, a lot of these weirs were built for old water mills, which are long gone, and they could easily be removed. But there are plenty of sites where, long culverts, for example, fish won't travel through because it's dark.
Right. I never considered the amount of weirs and blockages on the rivers. Yeah.
So there's a lot to be done to restore rivers, and there are solutions to this. It's not like we can't do anything about it. For example, on the pollution side, a corridor of trees or woodland along a lowland river, particularly a lowland river valley, has enormous benefits in intercepting the fertilizers that run off the fields and pesticides that come from cereal fields, and preventing them getting into the water in the first place.
And even polluting the sea. So, we
should ultimately
be
polluting the sea. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, trees and wild plants in general have a fantastic capacity for taking up nutrients in their roots and continuing to grow. And I mean, in the same vein, constructed wetlands, which one of your previous guests spoke, Phelim Harty spoke about, they represent a really innovative way of dealing with wastewater. So, for example, the water from a septic tank or from a bigger development, such as a village even, can be channeled through a constructed wetland with reeds and other water plants, which again will take up the nutrients and prevent them going into the land and ultimately into rivers.
And I mean, there are solutions. Is it just financial constraints, or is it the will?
I think policy. It starts with policy in government, and I mean, for instance, the state agency, the Office of Public Works, is still responsible for arterial drainage, which began in the 1940s with an act of the Oireachtas, and there's ample evidence that has produced huge damage to our rivers through drainage, through straightening, deepening of rivers so that water flows off the land quicker, causing floods downstream, etc. And really, that should be stopped. And more innovative ways of dealing with flooding, such as recreating floodplains, recreating the bends in rivers so that it slows down the water and and better still, restoring the peatlands in the mountains, which should act like a big sponge, holding back the water, releasing it slowly, just the same way that, for example, snow in the mountains in Europe holds the water and releases it slowly on melting.
Interesting. So how do we get this policy change? I mean, is it because the big business with money is supporting governments and I mean, how do we get the change?
I think one of the change factors for change is the climate action, because I think the link between climate action and biodiversity is the nature-based solutions. We have solutions in nature which we know well about. For example, restoring peatlands and restoring the vegetation on bogs and restoring functional bogs holds huge amounts of carbon. But it also has the beneficial effect of holding large amounts of water and preventing flooding downstream.
Yeah, I mean, we understand that, but I have spoken to so many people who have small scale turf cutting operations they've had for years. And I have failed to explain to anybody or convince anybody why the bogs should be left. It seems to be a very difficult one to sell.
Yeah, it's not just about leaving them. It's about restoring them. Because many of our bogs are completely damaged. The Midland bogs, I think 99% of them are destroyed. And there is now a program of re-wetting involving Burren and other agencies. But, another nature-based solution to climate change is, as you know, is planting trees and allowing woodland restoration naturally by regeneration. Of course, that can only be done if you control grazing or remove grazing altogether, ideally.
So does it boil down
that will absorb carbon as well, but it also has the benefits I've mentioned for rivers in terms of absorbing runoff, pollution and nutrients.
But so is the key to it to be able to pay the farmers enough money to replace their income to do the right thing? Is that the key to it, or is there a different?
Yeah, it's one of the keys. I mean, there's no single golden bullet, silver bullet for this issue. There are many. It's just like the climate action question. There are many ways in which we can reduce emissions. There are many ways in which we can assist biodiversity as well. And really, they all should be part of the solution. I mean, there are many people doing really good work in nature conservation around the country. And indeed, restoration is becoming a feature now. But it needs to be scaled up to a landscape scale. In the national park in Wicklow, for instance, they've begun blocking drains on some of the mountain peatlands to try and restore vegetation to those bare peats, which are heavily eroded by overgrazing. And they're dealing with, a handful, maybe 5 hectares in total. There's about 300 hectares of eroded bog in Wicklow Mountains alone. So, it needs to be scaled up. And the same goes for woodland planting and for, restoration of damaged habitats of all sorts.
But if the money was there, would it happen, do you think?
It depends how the money is spent. National Parks and Wildlife Service have recently had their budget doubled. We still have to see how effectively that's going to be spent. Is it just going to be absorbed by paying more staff to do the same things, or is there going to be change of direction to focus on restoring some of our damaged habitats, as opposed to just designating them as protected areas, which has happened to date without really much active management on any of them.
Yeah, I mean, so the Burren Nature Sanctuary really, we believe, is like a beacon for biodiversity. And I think the first step is education of people by bringing people out into nature so that they actually learn to love it and then get a passion to help conservation. But we don't have these places to go. So, I mean, I would wish that places like this, beacons for biodiversity, where people can come and learn, should be available to the public. They should be owned by the OPW. We should have one in every county, so people come, enjoy nature, find out what's there, get exposed to what's here, and then get a more of an understanding of what we've lost in these little pockets that have been conserved.
Public land is significant in this country. Quilcha manage about 7% of the Irish landscape, Bord na Móna, a big percentage. And the national parks, between them, there are 7 national parks in the country, some of them very extensive. The Wicklow Mountains is the biggest national park, actually. And if those were properly managed for nature, with nature as a high priority, then that would make a significant contribution. And of course, to climate action as well. So I think that would be the first step. And that's in the government control. It's not something you or I can change, other than with our votes. But I completely agree with you that if people don't know and love nature, they won't vote for it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So that the work you're doing, and many others are doing as well, in opening up places that are interesting and inspiring in nature to the average person who has little or no contact with it other than television programs and podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a first step. And also, obviously, the work you're doing with your books and Wild Waters. Would you like to say a final little bio of Wild Waters? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mentioned that it was inspired by walking the full length of the Avonmore River in Wicklow. But it's more than that. It goes on to explore rivers in general around the country, lakes, and artificial waterways like canals and ponds, and even constructed wetlands, and have a look at those as well. So in each case, I've visited a range of these places, talked to the people who manage them and who love them, and tried to get a sense of what makes them tick, what makes the people tick, and what is important for the future of these rivers and other wetlands. And there's a lot in common between them, of course.
Would you like to read a little section from the book?
This is a short piece from my new book, Wild Waters, which will be in the shops from the beginning of May this year. It's the opening lines of the chapter on rivers. And it starts with a little short poem by Robert Louis Stevenson, famous poet. It's called Looking Glass River. And this was written in 1885, believe it or not. Smooth it glides upon its travel, here a wimple, there a gleam. Oh, the clean gravel, oh, the smooth stream. Sailing blossoms, silver fishes, paved pools as clear as air. How a child wishes to live down there. So when I stand beside the clear bubbling water of the river that flows through our farm, I look up to the hill where it rises, a rocky summit called Carrick, covered in heather and gorse. Here the water trickles from springs and boggy hollows to coalesce in several small streams that eventually form a single channel. Generations of local farmers used the river to water their livestock and drain their wetter fields to ensure that the water ran more quickly down the slope. In times of heavy rainfall, the river becomes a raging torrent, carrying brown, peaty water off the hill, down the valley and through the village. The debris of fallen branches and leaves is washed downstream. Gravel beds are washed clean of silt, and the floods allow trout and salmon to move upstream to their traditional spawning grounds. It's likely that the river has been running here just like this since the last glaciers retreated many thousands of years ago.
Wild Waters by Richard Nairn and published by Gill Books is now available to purchase in bookshops and online. News from Burren Nature Sanctuary. We are open daily from 10 to 5 p.m. Early purple orchids are blooming in the woodland, and marsh orchids are out in the botany bubble. Mountain avens, bloody cranesbill and burnet rose are flowering in the outside living collection, and the bee orchids are ready to burst in the next week. Call in to see us.